When did Hinduism begin? If Christianity began with Christ, Islam with Muhammad, Buddhism with the Buddha, when did Hinduism begin?
When do you want it to begin?
I appreciate your generosity, but I didn't think I have a choice.
Actually, you do. And let me explain how. According to the Hindus themselves, Hinduism began with the creation of the world. So Hinduism begins with creation. And this is their belief, or at least the belief of most Hindus. And we may or may not be disposed to accept it. Historians like to maintain that one could place the beginnings of Hinduism around the 7th millennium BCE, before the Common Era. That is around 7000 BC. Because it is around that time that they placed the beginnings of a civilization, which is now called Harappan civilization, or more often Harappan culture, which reached its more mature phase around the 3rd millennium BCE, but its roots can be traced back to the 7th millennium, to a place called Mehergarh. It's an archaeological site. And I'm sharing these details with you because they are important for identifying the beginning of Hinduism, at least from the perspective of the historian. Because some of the practices which we identify with Hinduism even today, like the Namaste gesture of greeting, like the swastika sign, like married Hindu women putting vermilion in the parting in their hair. These are already in evidence in Harappan culture on the basis of the finds on these archaeological sites. So if you regard it as a defensible argument that if these practices have been a part of Hinduism for 7,000 years, more than that, and they can be traced back to that period, then that is when we have to date the beginning of that particular religion. Others argue that it is true that this culture has been identified archaeologically, and in fact was a very important culture in the ancient world, because the area it covered exceeds the area of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the two other contemporary riparian systems, religious systems or cultural systems combined. But we have no access to the thoughts of these people because the script has not been deciphered. It is referred to as the Indus script, although some people even doubt whether it's a script. The first literary document of Hinduism are the Vedas, and among them the Rig Veda is considered the oldest. The Rig Veda has been placed by scholars in various ages And I will not go into that. It's a very contested point as to when was the Rig Veda put together. So the question is, when was it put together? But most scholars, not all, very significantly, but most scholars believe that this happened around 1500 BCE, before the Common Era or the Christian era. So that is another point where you can date the beginning of Hinduism as a date of the Rig Veda. Another group of scholars, however, argues that what we have in the Vedas is Vedism, not Hinduism. What we call Hinduism is the product of the interaction of this Vedic tradition with two other religions, at least two other religions, Buddhism and Jainism, which arose, according to most scholars, in the 6th century BCE. This form of Vedism emerges around the 4th century, begins to emerge around the 4th century BCE. So you can argue, plausibly, that that is when Hinduism really starts, because what we call Hinduism is not just pure Vedism, but the Vedic tradition after its interaction, the shape it took after its interaction with Buddhism and Jainism. Another group of scholars maintains that there were many traditions on the Indian subcontinent before the coming of Islam to India. There was no single unified tradition, which we might call Hinduism, or refer to by one term. Just as you might say that polytheism under the Roman Empire, there was no such thing as Roman polytheism. There were different gods, and they were worshipped. And to call all of them Roman polytheism is an abstraction or a construct. And this is what it would be if we call the traditions before the arrival of Islam in India, as Hinduism. With the presence of Islam in India, these various traditions acquired a sense of identity. And so we have to date the beginning of Hinduism from after the presence of Islam in India, probably from the 14th century or the 16th, around that period, when these traditions of the Indian subcontinent, other than Islam, acquired an identity in contrast to Islam and started looking upon themselves in some sense as a homogeneous entity or a single entity. Another group of scholars feels that this process actually did not take place after the arrival of Islam. It really took place with the arrival of the West in India, in the form of British rule, Christianity, modern science, and so on. And so, the sense of the various traditions of India, which were not Muslim, but identified themselves with some degree of self-consciousness as a single tradition, only occurred in the 18th century, when Indians like Raja Ram Mohan Roy started talking about Hinduism. So, you have this choice of when Hinduism began. You shouldn't be surprised by this. Hinduism often offers an embarrassment of riches, of choice. And in this case, it also seems to apply to the beginning of Hinduism itself.